What makes a healthy TCG format? Obviously, we as players are very good at identifying when formats are unhealthy, and there is an untold number of videos and articles talking about the various times in which points game developers really messed up their game and made it not fun. But what about the formats that are good? Obviously, when we look back, we can sometimes acknowledge, oh yeah, that format was healthy. But how do we identify one while it's going on? And especially additionally, if you're a game designer, how do you strive to achieve a healthy format? What's the criteria? How do you figure that out? I actually think it's simpler than you would think. For me, there's basically two criteria that make a healthy TCG format, and obviously there are additional details to each of these criteria, but mostly there are two things. Number one, the format should be diverse. Now, we're going to talk about this as the video goes on because diversity can mean a lot of different things to different people. What's the actual number that means diversity? What's the metagame share that means something means something is unhealthy and has too much metagame share? That's something that on a nitpicky kind of case by case basis, you have to figure out. But at a core point, you can't have one deck that has 70% meta share and have a healthy metagame probably. Secondly, you need to have games that feel dynamic. I've chosen the word dynamic really specifically here. It would be easy to instead say, I think, to have games that are healthy or to have games that are good. And both of those were, or to have games that are fun even. And the F word in particular is one that I think you have to stay away from when you're trying to make a qualitative assessment about whether or not a TCG format is healthy. The reason for this is that fun is a fully subjective detail, right? The kinds of things that one player finds fun, the other might find completely miserable. And similarly, good is just too general a term. What's good gameplay? That's going to mean different things for different people. And I even thought about using the word interactive here, but that also isn't 100% necessary, I think, to have a healthy TCG format. It doesn't necessarily need to be one where players are constantly interacting with each other. There can be formats that are healthy that don't necessarily feature a ton of interactive games. Instead, I've chosen the word dynamic very specifically because I think what's really important is that on a game-by-game basis, you should ideally be feeling like you are making different decisions and needing to make choices that are contextual specifically to that game that you are playing. If it gets to the point where every game, again, in a certain matchup, you sit down and you know how the first 8 to 10 actions that you're going to take in that game are going to look, that's a problem. And that's likely an indication of a format that is unhealthy. The last thing that I have, and I have this as more of a nice to have, I will not rule out a format's health because of this, because this is sort of something that is extra to the game design element of things. But ideally, the deck should be affordable. It's not really reasonable to say, oh yeah, this format is really healthy. Look at this incredibly diverse meta and the games are so dynamic. Also, every game and every deck in the metagame costs $1,000. At that point, is the format really healthy if many players can't access it? I think there's a reasonable argument that it's not, even though it's strictly from a game design standpoint, it probably is. So without further ado, let's get into some unhealthy formats. These are the ones that everyone can identify right off the bat. I had a lot of options when it came to picking unhealthy formats. Obviously, there are so many TCGs, and at varying different times, those formats have broken. And there's a lot of content about broken TCG formats, and so I don't want to kind of belabor the point on this too much, but I've picked a couple, one that everyone will probably know or have heard of if they're tapped into most kind of popular TCGs, and then one that people are probably a little bit less aware of because I think it is illustrative of a different kind of problem. So let's start with the one that everyone will know, and this is Eldrazi Winter. So Eldrazi Winter was a Magic the Gathering format in the modern format, a format that has been much maligned in Magic's history. So Eldrazi Winter happened at Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch. What happened was that in this set, Wizards of the Coast finally printed playable, cheap Eldrazi creatures. There had previously been A number of Eldrazi printed and support for Eldrazi printed in the original Rise of the Eldrazi set, in the original Zendikar block, but there had never been a coherent way to play these cards, despite the fact that they had two very powerful lands in Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple. Both of these lands tapped for 2 mana functionally, and in the case of Eye of Ugin, it made even more than 2 mana because it was per creature. You reduced their cost by 2. And what happened was that Oath of the Gatewatch introduced a bunch of Eldrazi that cost 2, 3, 4, 5. In particular, Reality Spasher and Thought-Knot Seer are the two chief offenders that made these decks particularly broken and problematic, though cards like Matter Reshaper are also to blame as well. What happened was that at this particular Pro Tour, some teams figured out that Eldrazi was broken. And so the teams that brought Eldrazi had a very, very high conversion rate. 6 of the top 8 decks were Eldrazi. There were many, many more that did well, including, a number of players. But the meta did not yet look truly unhealthy. And the reason was not everyone had come to the conclusion that playing this Eldrazi deck was the best thing to do. However, in subsequent weeks at premier level tournaments, it became increasingly clear that Eldrazi was the best thing to be doing in the format. And what happened was that the metagame devolved into how do you best implement the Eldrazi? You had people playing it in different shells, but at the core, it was still this same kind of 40-card core of these lands that tapped for extra mana and these Eldrazi creatures that were going to pummel your opponent and disrupt them at a very accelerated rate. This format was miserable, and it only lasted for about 2 months before a ban went in place that finally curtailed the kind of Eldrazi menace. This format obviously fails for multiple reasons. At times, the Eldrazi decks had more than 50% of the meta share of the modern format. That's way too much, obviously. But then additionally, the matches that these decks were playing were really uninteresting. A lot of the times the games just came down to which player opened more of these lands that tapped for 2 mana, and very little other things mattered in those matchups, because if you were just ahead an extra 2 mana every turn, you were going to win the game. And so as a result, these games were not skill intensive. A lot of the times they felt very coin flippy, and for everyone else in the format, it was not very easy to basically tech your way into having a playable matchup against Eldrazi. The deck was just so brute force powerful that you couldn't do it. And so it wasn't dynamic for anyone. It wasn't even like you could make choices in your deck building to be able to have an interesting matchup against Eldrazi. It was just too good. So Eldrazi Winter is a well-known incident. The other one I could have referenced, I think, was Hogak. That's the other one I thought about talking about, but that's the one I went with. One that I think people are much less likely to be aware of is the Star Wars Unlimited metagame shortly after the game came out. I love Star Wars Unlimited. I'm probably going to make another video on the channel about it, but I decided to do this one first. And Star Wars Unlimited is a very fun game, but boy did they miss in the first couple of sets on a couple of key cards. Most notably, and this is important context, Star Wars Unlimited is a leader-based game. So the cards that you are able to play in your deck are dependent on your leader and the color of the base that you attach to that leader. Essentially, this is what determines the color of cards that you're going to put in your deck. Star Wars Unlimited also uses a system similar to, say, like Lorcana, where every card in your hand can be a resource. What this means is that decks are exceptionally consistent. Lastly, you draw 2 cards a turn in Star Wars Unlimited, which further adds to the consistency of decks. The upshot of this is when the developers of Star Wars Unlimited, Fantasy Flight, miss on a leader being too powerful, because you always have access to the leader, and because you always are going to draw a relatively consistent version of what your deck is trying to do, it can get oppressive. And the chief belligerent of this was Boba Fett from Set 1, Spark of Rebellion, in Star Wars Unlimited. Boba Fett was broken for a variety of reasons, but the biggest one is that the breakpoints on this card were just wrong. He had one extra attack than he should have. Every other leader that's been printed since has not had these 4/7 stat lines. They've been 3/7s or 4/6, and the one stat matters. In a game where you're always going to be able to access this card on the same term every game, it does mean that the play patterns around it are going to look similar, and the game is balanced around the play patterns of these cards flipping up at particular times. Additionally, Boba's ability to ready resources for interacting with your opponent's units was so unreasonable and just allowed for tempo swings that no other deck in the format could conceivably keep up with at all. The meta share in set 1 was not that bad. In set 1, there were other decks being played. Players hadn't fully figured out how to leverage Boba Fett, but by set 2, the wheels had really fell off, and although we don't have a ton of metagame data because there weren't that many tournaments being played yet or that many tournaments being documented, the data I can find has Boba Fett at winning 56% of tournaments as the winner, which is just an absurd number. And it also put 41% of pilots into the top 8, which is, again, not reasonable, not fair at all. And the other problem with this was that the Boba Fett games felt so bad to play. They were not dynamic because you would sit there on the other side of the table and you would be looking at your hand and you would feel as though it did not matter what you did. Your choices were irrelevant. If the Boba Fett player had overwhelming barrage, if the Boba Fett player was going to be able to flip Boba Fett up and overwhelming barrage your play and then get to play something else for 2 resources or maybe even 3 resources, you were dead. The game was just over. And so that kind of really stagnant, static gameplay is why this metagame was quite bad. And Boba Fett did ultimately tank a ban before the beginning of set 3, thus kind of saving us from the Boba menace. I think this is a less known metagame because obviously this game is less popular, but it is illustrative of something that I think is kind of cautionary, which is that as modern TCGs gear themselves toward ensuring that every game features a maximum number of interactions between players, if you miss on one of these highly repeatable interactions, it is going to break the format really fundamentally. There are a lot of games that are leaning into this now. Star Wars Unlimited is one of them, but Riftbound, One Piece TCG, Lorcana, even games like Flesh and Blood, where you have a leader as well. These are all games that are trying to ensure that every game, both players get to take a large number of game actions and that they get to feel as though they are engaged in the game. Now, on average, I think that's a good thing, but this specific case study is an example of when it can go bad, it goes really bad. And actually, Star Wars Unlimited has one other instance where this happened pretty significantly, although it was not as bad as Boba. If you want to know more about the Star Wars Unlimited meta, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to make a longer video, but I figured I'd throw one in here just because it is my current favorite game to play in paper, and I wanted to talk about it. Now, formats can also be unhealthy because they fail one of the 2 criteria that I have laid out. Obviously, Eldrazi Winter and Boba 1 failed both. They were not diverse and the gameplay was not dynamic. But it's actually possible to have a format that is unhealthy that fails for only one of these reasons. And I think some people will actually find subjectively those formats not so bad. One of these formats that I wanted to talk about that I haven't personally played, but I've been doing a bunch of research on, is the Tierlament format in Yu-Gi-Oh! So Tierlament was a tier 0 strategy. Undeniably, it was the best thing to be doing in that particular metagame in around 2022. And it tanked a bunch of bans. It's like not playable to the same degree anymore in any way. And at times it featured meta shares in the like 65 to 70% range, which is obscene. Like that's an obscenely high metagame share. But all the research that I've done on it and everything that I've kind of seen about the format is that a lot of players, especially players who are kind of playing at a higher level, said, yeah, it is tier 0, but the games are good. Because at the end of the day, the deck was based around doing interactive things. It was highly variable because the strategy is based around self-milling yourself and flipping cards off the top of your deck in order to get additional effects. And what that is going to lead to is fundamentally dynamic gameplay, because you're not going to have the same game every time because it's entirely based on what you flip. As a result, there are people who still just go back and play Tierlament format. It's a thing that people do. Uh, because clearly the actual games felt dynamic and interesting enough that it kind of outweighed the fact that you were potentially sitting down for a 9-round tournament where you were going to play the Tierlament mirror 7 or 8 times. Those games were dynamic and interesting enough that players were willing to engage with them anyway. Another format that is unhealthy for diversity reasons, but probably not for gameplay reasons, is the current Star Wars Unlimited format. I know I already just talked about one, but this one's also pretty good. The current format is dominated by 3 decks. It's kind of a triangle format, but not really, because these 3 decks just beat up on everything else. You have Han, you have Yoda, and you have Han again. There's actually both Hans, yeah. Young Han and old Han is kind of how people call them in the in the community. And these decks represent close to 50% of the win rate share for tournaments, and they represent a little bit under 50% for the top 8 share, which I think on a diversity basis is a little high. You would like to see other decks getting in there at a slightly higher rate, but, you know, it's not the end of the world. But the reality is actually that the gameplay between these top decks in the format currently is pretty good and interesting. It's very dynamic. The decks that are the best are all mid-range or mid-range control decks. And as a result, you have to make really engaging decisions based on the texture of your draw. And importantly, none of these decks are being really oppressive based around their leader flip, which is the most repeatable thing that can happen in Star Wars Unlimited. The leader abilities of these three leaders are very strong, and it is undeniably why they are the top dogs in the metagame currently. But it's not so oppressive that it feels as though the games revolve entirely around them and you have to be constantly mindful and playing around them. Like, it's just the powerful thing that these leaders do. As a result, you have another metagame that I think fails on a diversity basis. I don't think that you could tell anyone that, you know, we have a metagame where 3 decks occupy half the meta share and nothing else cracks 5%, and have them say, yeah, that seems reasonable. But at the same time, the actual gameplay is dynamic and interesting, so it's not that bad. And I think there's a lot of people who would be pretty fervent defenders of this current format and say, hey, you know, I actually really like this and I wouldn't change anything. And, you know, I would not fault you for saying that, basically. Hello, I'm in a different outfit because I'm currently editing, and I realized I missed a pretty key piece of context when talking about this Star Wars Unlimited metagame. I mentioned that 50% meta share for 3 decks is probably a little bit high, and I'm sure if you are a player of some games, you would actually welcome a three deck kind of triangle that was taking up 50% of the meta. That would be fine for some games. In this case, it's not. I think Star Wars has on average been able to produce far more diverse metas than that, and that has to do with kind of some of the key mechanics in the game and the way that deck building works. But obviously in other games, a 3-deck meta would be fine and you would be okay with it. It's just contextual, and I forgot to mention that in the video, and I wanted to mention that now before we get into the next part of the video. So while I just talked about formats that are unhealthy from like an objective standpoint, they failed a diversity test, they actually have pretty good gameplay, and as a result, I think you would find some pretty strong defenders. I think, interestingly, you are more likely to find formats that pass the diversity test, but because they failed the gameplay test, a lot of people would have less positive feelings about them. A good example of this is pre the One Ring and Amped Raptor ban Modern. In Modern Horizons 3, Wizards of the Coast printed Guide of Souls and Ocelot Pride, 2 very powerful white 1-drops that supercharged this Energy Engine Boros mid-range deck that later went on to also adopt the One Ring as well as a kind of powerful engine. This deck was a kind of mid-range demon. it was exceptionally powerful at playing these long, fair games. It had so many draws where it could pressure you early, but then subsequently have this very live top of the deck because Amped Raptor represented this powerful 2-for-1. Ocelot Pride, once enough permanents got into play, represented this very fast clock, even if it was just by itself. And as a result, this created a metagame pressure that was pretty negative. So what the metagame kind of devolved into was these Boros decks that were mid-range decks. Then you had decks that were trying to beat the Boros decks. Most commonly, this was combo decks, because this was the one avenue in which the Boros deck was not very good at interacting on. So you had both Storm and Mono Blue Belcher, which is like a deck that's trying to play only MDFCs and kill your opponent with a Goblin Char Belcher. That deck's really sweet, by the way. The Mono Blue Belcher deck is cool. But you had those decks, which were basically trying to circumvent the fact that this Boros deck was, highly interactive, except on the stack. And so because it wasn't as interactive on the stack, you could usually find ways to combo through it, or you could just go faster than they could conceivably interact with you. And then as a future development into that, for a while the metagame was Boros, combo decks to beat Boros. And then some people started playing like blue-black Psychic Frog or decks like this that were intending to beat up on the combo decks. But the side effect of that is that the Boros midrange decks annihilated these anti-combo decks. And if you are familiar with, TCG formats, you're probably thinking that I am describing a triangle format. And I am, to an extent. But triangle formats, I think in a healthy state, typically revolve around 3 decks that have good matchups into each other, but you don't want the matchups to be like 70-30, which is what this format had kind of devolved into. There were a lot of games that were extremely lopsided. There were a lot of games where you would sit down, your opponent would reveal what they were playing by playing their first land. You would take a heavy sigh and just, feel as though you lost the matchup lottery for this particular round. And, you would take your lopsided coin flip and probably lose. To make matters even worse, even the mirror matches for a lot of these games were not super dynamic. I think that when you ended up playing one of these anti-combo decks against one of these other anti-combo decks, those games could potentially be pretty dynamic and interesting, which was good. And I also think that the Boros mid-range mirrors could be dynamic, but once players started to adopt the One Ring in particular, those matchups got much, much less interesting because that card was so oppressively powerful. Lastly, the big problem about this is that even though this metagame looked diverse, it was an absolute nightmare to do any kind of brewing in. Modern is a format where historically it's been possible to find a reasonable number of kind of fringe decks that you can still pick up wins with. And I think it's a pretty good litmus test for the format being healthy or not, that is possible. And what had happened was that we had gotten to a state where if you were building a brew, you probably couldn't build a combo brew, because if it ended up against one of the other combo decks or against the anti-combo decks in the metagame, you were dead. So you had kind of 33% of the meta that you could possibly attack. If you were playing a mid-range deck and you ended up against Boros, you were losing very, very often. And similarly, because of the presence of all the combo decks in the format, you were losing to the combo decks. And if you tried to brew something that wasn't one of these kind of like established anti-combo decks, you were likely just going to run into problems where you were maybe not quite as good against combo, you were losing to the mid-range decks still, and you were probably losing the mirror to these other anti-combo decks that were better situated to be interactive. The metagame was miserable, and there were a lot of things about it that made it feel undynamic. I think one other element that is underrated in that ban list, and I didn't talk about it initially, is that in addition to the One Ring and Amped Raptor leaving, they also banned Gigantha the Wellspring, which is, I think, actually one of the cards that in particular violates that kind of game should be dynamic tenet that I have set up. Gigantha coming out of the Companion Zone meant that a lot of the time these Boros decks just had extra gas that no one else in the format, well, not no one else, but that none of the other top tier decks in the format had access to. And it felt very derivative, a lot of the games did, where you would just kind of trade off resources and then eventually die to the Giganta. And so that ban was also, I think, very important. Interestingly, the other upshot of this ban list was that a number of cards were unbanned, and I do think that post this format, Modern has been in one of the healthiest states that it has ever been. So it's interesting that all it took to kind of topple this problematic metagame, this unhealthy metagame, was just chopping out the mid-range deck, right? That ban list only targeted Boros, did not target the other two pillars of that format. But once you made it so that it was conceivable to play other mid-range decks, it all of a sudden meant that you could play mid-range with a better matchup into combo. It meant that you could play decks that could target these anti-combo decks that didn't just immediately die to Boros. And so it's interesting how quickly they were able to flip that. I am once again coming to you from the editing booth, so to speak. I'm going to keep saying in the next segment that it is the current format of Yu-Gi-Oh! That I'm talking about, which is wrong. Obviously, there was a ban list kind of recently, but at the time of the recording, the ban list was fresh, but I think Burst Protocol hadn't come out yet, so the new meta hadn't fully crystallized. Anyway, all this to say, I say current metagame or format a bunch, and really what I mean is like the pre-ban list and Burst Protocol metagame, which is obviously slightly different. Now, I talked about a triangle format that was unhealthy, and that wasn't an exact triangle format because it was more that there was a triangle of archetypes kind of fighting each other. But triangle formats are something that I think people have historically liked, and that in some contexts can be viewed as healthy. I think it depends game to game on whether or not a format where only 3 archetypes are kind of playable and are the kind of chief players in the metagame is fine. But certainly there are games where that is true. And one of the kind of, I think, really nice triangle archetypes that exists currently is the current Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta. So the current Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta is set up around 3 decks that play well into each other. We have Draco Tail, which is the most popular of the 3. We have Mitsurugi Yumi, and we have Canine Vanquish Soul as the other kind of pillar of the format. These decks foil off each other in that they are all mid-ranging decks that are trying to do slightly different things. And so as a result, their interaction kind of plays into each other more or less. For example, the Canine decks have better ways to interact with Draco Tail's Femina, whereas Mitsurugi Yumi is a little bit better into Canine Vanquish Soul because of the kind of idiosyncrasies about how their combo is executed. And it's interesting because this meta had existed for a while. It was liked by players, especially after Yu-Gi-Oh! Made the decision to remove a lot of the really problematic floodgates in the format, which were leading to uninteresting games. I think that the Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta was in maybe one of the healthiest states that it had ever been in because the games were really dynamic and, you know, it was a triangle format, but that was fine for Yu-Gi-Oh! Three decks as the pillar of the metagame is frankly above average for that game a lot of the time. So totally reasonable. Somewhat surprisingly, Konami made a decision to make a bunch of changes to these decks and to weaken all 3 pillars of the triangle. But that is more to do with the fact that they knew 6 months out in the OCG, the game that is played in Asia, that nothing that was being printed was going to meaningfully upset this meta. And I think this is one kind of cautionary tale about TCG formats, which is that they can be healthy and that's fine, but people will eventually get sick of them. You do want there to eventually be some dynamic change. And so Konami, I think, was trying to force that through by upending the triangle a little bit. But is this triangle format healthy? Yeah, absolutely it is. The games are dynamic. They're very different on a case-by-case basis. If you watched my first video on the channel, you know that I personally get really frustrated playing against Draco Tail, but I cannot sit here and tell you that the deck is unfair. The deck is a very reasonable deck to have be one of the best things in the format, and there are plenty of ways that you can fight against it. I just tilt off the planet when Femina 6-for-1s me. Triangle formats, though, are not always healthy. And I think a pretty interesting example, and this has taken things back quite a ways, is the 2012 Pokemon Worlds format. This is a strange time in Pokemon history because they had a fundamental change to the way that their rules worked that allowed players to do things, way more things on the first turn than you would normally be able to do. And consequently, they had to kind of force rotate like 6 or 7 sets unexpectedly because those sets had been designed with different rules implementations in mind. And as a result, you ended up with a very small set format that was dominated by a triangle. And the triangle was Mewtwo, Darkrai, and Terrakion. Pokemon's a little bit interesting because it lends itself to being a triangle format or somewhat like a triangle format implicitly because of the weakness system in that game, where, if you have a particularly dominant deck, it's conceivable that you can just register a deck that is going to have inherent advantage against it because of the weakness game mechanic. What happened in this format, though, was that Mewtwo was oppressively powerful and basically forced everything else out of the format except for Darkrai, which was also very powerful and could play Mewtwo as well, and Terrakion, which had an inherent advantage against those decks. So this was a triangle format, kind of, but if you look at the World's meta in particular, it is not a pretty sight. You have 7 of 8 decks in the top 8 are all playing Darkrai. 6 of them, I think, are playing Mewtwo. There's one hero who showed up with Celebi, who made it to the top 8, and there were obviously some other players in the top 32 who didn't have to play exactly one of these 3 decks, but this format is largely regarded as one of the least healthy in Pokemon history. And I think there's 2 factors at play. One is that they lost a bunch of sets unexpectedly due to the rule change, and 2, this triangle really just oppressed everything else, and also the games between these decks in the triangle were not very interesting. They were largely about who drew the double energy first, whether or not you could knock out your opponent's Mewtwo with your Mewtwo, because that's a thing. Mewtwo has advantage against Mewtwo. Sorry, that's the context there. Very strange. But yeah, all this to say, triangle formats, they can be healthy. I think the current Yu-Gi-Oh one is, but they can also definitely not be. Okay, so to sum up, what are some truly healthy formats? I've spent a lot of time talking about ones that are either definitely not healthy or ones that I think personally fail my evaluation for healthy, but that I think many people would like. But what are some really good TCG formats that undeniably pass these heuristics of being healthy and also I think are beloved by their various communities? The current one that I would like to talk about, I think this is my gold standard healthy format, is Khans of Tarkir Theros Standard. So this was the standard environment in Magic more than 10 years ago, I say, as I crumble into dust. And, and this format was defined by a couple of particularly potent decks and then 5 or 6 decks that occupied kind of the tier 2 section of the metagame. The 2 best decks in the format were Abzan and Jeskai. These were mid-range decks built around kind of opposite color pairings, which meant that they were fundamentally doing very different things. That meant that the games between these decks were pretty dynamic. Also, again, because these decks were both mid-range decks, the games against each other, like the mirror matches, were extremely dynamic. And it wasn't as though you were completely doomed if you didn't want to register one of these 2 decks. There were control decks that were playable in this format, in blue-black control. You could play aggro. There were a variety of either mono-red or red-green aggro decks that were playable in this format. I played blue-green Flash in this format at my local game store for like a year. And I won a couple of FNMs playing this complete brew into a room full of people playing, decks from the meta. It was fundamentally very interesting for a couple of reasons. One, the mana was very good for the time. There were fetch lands in Khans of Tarkir, and that meant that it really opened up to deck building for 2-color decks in particular, but also for the 3-color decks that defined that set. And secondly, a lot of the cards that had high power were gated behind 3 pips of mana. Again, the Khans of Tarkir set design was based around the various shards that exist. So all of the powerful cards cost 3 different types of mana. And what that meant is that by and large, you had to make considered choices about what your deck was going to fundamentally be about. You didn't just get to splash all the best cards. After this set rotated and Khans was still in standard, but Theros was gone, it got worse. In particular, the mana improved such that you could break that rule that I was talking about, and we started to see the rise of decks like Jeskai Black, which all of a sudden were breaking a lot of those paradigms and being able to play more of the really premium cards. I was interrupted. One of my cats is very excited about Khans of Tarkir Theros Standard, no doubt. Mabel, you might have been old enough to be around for Khans of Tarkir Theros Standard. I think it's possible. I think it's possible. Okay, so the last couple I want to talk about is I want to kind of give credit where credit's due. Oh my God, where are we going? Let's put you over here. I want to give credit where credit's due, and I want to say that actually many of the current metagames for a lot of the kind of newer TCGs are very healthy. The one that I looked at in particular is Riftbound. Riftbound is obviously very new. They only just released their second set now, but their metagame data is extremely promising. There are a number of decks that are above 5% meta share, and while there are a couple of decks that are in the 15% range, that I think is not that bad for a leader-based deck or leader-based game. And I think that a lot of the reason why we're starting to see this increase in healthy formats in these new trading card games is related to the fact that games are being designed with having dynamic games in mind. Like I mentioned earlier with Star Wars Unlimited, when you increase the consistency of decks by adding leaders, and by kind of making the mana less random, or the resources, I should say, less random like they are in Magic the Gathering, you fundamentally increase the number of dynamic games because people are going to get to play. And so once you've done that, actually, in order to curate a healthy metagame, odds are you mostly just have to worry about diversity. If one particular leader is oppressively powerful, you're probably going to need to ban them. But ideally, because the gameplay patterns are going to be repeatable, you shouldn't necessarily have issues with one particular leader becoming exceptionally problematic, because a lot of the times, if the games are designed well, there are leaders that are set up in a way where they kind of naturally foil other leaders in the game. And so as a result, the metagame can be pretty dynamic in that way. And Current Riftbound is a decent example of that. One other thing I will say about Current Riftbound, at least, is that it is also at least trying to pass the decks are not super expensive test to varying degrees of success. Obviously, they reprinted some stuff, which was nice. Similarly, like One Piece has just announced that they're going to be reprinting a bunch of cards, meaning that their players can actually get access to them, which I think is also a good idea. The example that I gave earlier, the Khans Theros standard environment, the one knock on that format for sure is that the decks were a little expensive. I was trying to find exact details. I want to say that a standard deck in that time period was like in the range of $700 to $800 Canadian, which is too much. Granted, currently the best deck in standard is more than 1,000 Canadian, so I mean, it could be worse. But yeah, that's one other thing that I think is pretty interesting. Overall, a lot of these games now, though, are leading into having much healthier metagames purely based on game design alone, which I think is pretty interesting to look at. If we look at some of the older TCGs, like Pokemon, Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh!, their game design elements kind of naturally lead to having formats that feel really broken a lot more easily. In particular, in both Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh!, I think that you have these problems where, in Yu-Gi-Oh!, decks can be so consistent that you are going to run into problems where if a deck is consistently very powerful, it's just going to be the best thing to be doing. And similarly in Magic, a lot of the times when we miss and when a card is too strong and it starts to dominate a metagame, it is challenging for the rest of the meta to adapt in a way that feels dynamic. Yes, you can do things to combat problematically powerful cards, but a lot of the times the ways to do so involve playing like sideboard cards that are miserable, and that's not necessarily dynamic gameplay, I don't think. All in all, I guess I'll close this off by saying I think it's very interesting and very clear that we are getting better at making good TCG formats, not worse. The only games that I think are really struggling are games like Magic. And this is, I think, in large part due to the fact that they have become somewhat obsessed about a high release cadence of cards. So formats never get a chance to settle, and we never really get a chance to experience a really good format. Current standard is good from a metagame health standpoint. Like the most recent Pro Tour had 7 different decks in the top 8. But this metagame is going to be gone in a month. It's going to change. There's going to be new things. And it's just as easy to believe that one of the cards from the new set is going to break the format. And if it doesn't, that's great. But there's going to be another set 2 months after that. All in all, I think that designers are definitely getting better at identifying these healthy TCG formats and how to make healthy TCG formats. And I think we should at times be a little bit more appreciative of that fact. It's easy to kind of identify when things are really bad, but I think that we should as a community try to be a little bit more supportive when things are good.